everybody, and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and this week's episode is the Thunder Junction State of the Format Address Part 2. So, when Thunder Junction first came out, I mentioned that I thought it would be a decent idea going forward for the show to have not one, but two State of the Format addresses. I think it just kind of makes sense. Like, formats undergo enough evolution where what I say on week 1 and 2 is not going to directly apply to what I think is true about the format on week 6. So I think it's just a bit of a check-in at this, like, 3-quarter mark of the format is a pretty good way to go about it. Conveniently, also for this episode, there's also an Arena Open this weekend, 25th and 26th. So if you're playing in that, this can kind of double as a bit of a prep video. I mentioned pretty often on the show that these late-stage drafts, or honestly, any drafts that happen after week 3 of the format, tend to be pretty difficult because you're not going to be drafting with the people who only draft once or twice per set. The people that are still drafting at this point have a good idea of what they're doing. They know what the good cards, the good archetypes are. You're not just going to get those handed to you. So a lot of today's episode is going to be focused on how to navigate these tough tables, the directions that I've been leaning to find success this late in the format. And I think just in general, hoping to highlight some ideas, some cards, some archetypes that might not quite be on your radar so that your tricky drafts can be a little bit smoother. All right, let's jump in. I'm going to start off today with a segment that I've oh so cleverly named Things That Have Changed, which is just if you haven't played the format in the past 5 weeks, or maybe you have been playing the format and you haven't been doing as well, maybe you're still kind of stuck in the mindset of what was happening a few weeks ago, just wanted to start by putting out there some of the bigger things that I think have changed as the format's developed. I think it's going to really help set the stage when we get into some nitty gritty as we go on. So first thing, and this does happen in a lot of formats, but I think it's definitely happened for this one, is that the archetypes have self-corrected. The average drafter who's drafting now understands how good each archetype is just in the abstract and are more or less willing to draft those archetypes based on how strong those are. And what this means in practice is that the stronger archetypes, green-whites, green-black, you're not going to be able to get great versions of those decks as often as you used to, as often as you did week 1 and 2, and especially green-white. Actually, I haven't drafted a good green-white deck in weeks, and I've seen a lot of train wreck drafts of people that have reviewed their drafts where they first pick a Miriam, Herd Whisperer, the green-white gold uncommon, and then maybe even they take, let's say, a Griff, right? The other green-white uncommon, the 1/4 lifelink flying. Like, good start to a green-white deck, but then it's just not open because the person next to them also started in green-white, or maybe even the person 2 seats down. And one of the problems with green-white specifically is if you don't get enough good 2-drops, like you don't get the trained Airynxes, you don't get the good uncommons, your deck just falls apart. I think something like black-green, which is still a deck that I draft a decent amount, you don't need a very specific thing like having enough 2s or seeing the good mounts to make your synergies work. The green-black decks, they can kind of be a little bit less streamlined, a little bit more just like, here are my good cards, here I'm splashing. With green-white, though, I've been very hesitant to get into it. I think you can get into it, and you're going to have drafts where it's just like, wow, I first picked a Miriam, I got past the good uncommon, keep going, pick 5, oh, there's a throw from the saddle, keep going, oh, wow, I wield a Drover Grizzly, like the 4/2 that gives things trample. So their drafts do happen, but I would just really give a word of warning that if you are starting your draft like that, and you're getting excited, like, oh man, like this is going to be great, just remember that everybody else at the table has the knowledge that green-white is great, and there's probably a good number of people around you that have also started their drafts like that. And while green-white is a good deck, it's a really good deck when it gets there, it really cannot support more than a drafter, maybe 2, because there's just not a density of good 2-drops to go around, and you really need those. On the flip side of things, there's the worst deck in the format, quote-unquote the worst deck in the format, red-blue, that sometimes it's just wide open because you pretty often get tables where people have it in their head, rightly so. It's not an incorrect thing to think, but they know that red-blue is one of the weaker, if not the weakest deck, and you're gonna get like 5th pick Malcolm the Eyes, the blue-red rare hasty 2/2 that makes clues. And if you're at a table, like I've had tables like this, where nothing else really seems to be open, and you get a Malcolm, you get a late Slick sequence, the blue-red deal 2, if you've cast another spell this turn, draw a card, and even premium mono-red cards, like Scorching Shot, the red-red, deal 5 to something, Longhorn Sharpshooter, the 3/3 that you can plot it, deal 2 to something. Like, these cards you do see pretty consistently later than you would see good cards of other colors. I want to be clear that this isn't like, you shouldn't go in trying to be like, oh, I'm going to metagame them, I know blue-red's going to be open, nobody likes that deck. I'm just trying to illustrate both ends of the spectrum here, right? Just be vigilant about how you're drafting. If you start green-white and you're like, wow, I'm setting myself for the best deck, this is awesome, and it's not panning out, be careful about that. Don't be stubborn about it and be like, well, I'm just gonna stay the course and hope it works out. Most of the time, I don't think it will. Opposite is true as well. If you see good blue-red cards, for example, I'm using blue-red as just a stand-in for some of the worst decks in the format. If you see good blue-red cards a little bit later in the draft, don't go, I don't really want to be blue-red, like I know blue-red's not good. Blue-red had a lot of trouble early on because people were trying to draft it at about the same rate as all the other decks. But this is just, how draft works in an ideal world, that the weaker decks will become better when people don't like them and don't draft them as much. And blue-red definitely isn't so horribly bad that it's like one of those decks that sometimes there are decks in some formats where even if it is very open, you still shouldn't touch it. The worst deck in this format is not one where it's like, yeah, you still don't want to touch it even if you're the only drafter at the table. And in fact, I think you're going to have a really good deck if you're the only blue-red drafter at the table. And this might sound a bit obvious. Like you might be thinking, like, yeah, this is how draft just works. Like I just said a second ago, this is ideally how a draft format will pan out. I'm making a point of it here because some formats don't self-correct. And the advice I would give to people at the end of some formats is just like, yeah, people are still drafting the not very good decks, so you should still just try to draft the good decks. This isn't that format. People that are playing this format have caught on and have adjusted. And one wrinkle here is that often when people are conceptualizing a format and just understanding what the good decks are and what the not so good decks are, I think there's a tendency to think about the polar opposites where people, if you said to somebody who drafted the format, a reasonable amount, maybe once a day, maybe a little bit less than that. If you said to them, what are the top 3 decks in the format and what are the bottom 3 decks in the format? I think they could probably give you a pretty good idea. But unless you're like super in tune with the format, the middle ground often gets a bit murky for most people. And I think that's where you can gain an edge. The edge you're trying to gain with these decks in the middle is trying to find a few decks that, and this is often what I do, where I really get my money at the end of a format, trying to find a few decks that have flown under the radar. People don't perceive them to be quite good decks, but actually are good, and you get the cards for those decks later than you should. Like, even when a format has self-corrected, like Thunder Junction has, it doesn't self-correct perfectly. And I think the 2 decks in this format that fall in that middle ground of, they're not the absolute best decks, but they're definitely not the worst decks, and the average drafter that's drafting the format still, even though they have a good idea of how good the archetypes are still underrating these 2 decks. So those 2 decks are Black-White and Red-White. Black-White's a deck I've just been drafting a ton. It's, I think, at this point, maybe like 50% of my drafts are Black-White or Black-White splashing something. And Red-White's one that's really interesting because at the beginning of the format, during the first State of the Format Address episode, I made a point of saying how I think Red-White was quite bad, quite poor. Just like Blue-Red, a big part of it is that a lot of the cards that play fine in this deck, fill out your deck, we're just going way higher than the price you would want to pay for some of those cards in the draft. So just, bookmark Black-White and Red-White. We're going to come back to them. But yeah, decks I'm quite fond of right now. All right, so that's the first big thing that's changed. Just the archetypes have kind of evened out over the past few weeks. Second thing, and this one's been really notable, I've changed this as I've been drafting more, is you've got to take deserts earlier. You've got to lock them in. If you want them, you have to take them. And it's really rare, I find, you have a deck that just doesn't want deserts. Either you care about crimes, you care about the fixing, you care about desert synergies. When I open my pack and my rares kind of whatever, the uncommons don't stick out to me any as you would want because other people are gonna take them, it's that if you take deserts early, it makes a lot of your other cards better. Like take Cactarantula, for example. If I have to cast my Cactarantula for 6 mana, I'm not very happy about it. Like the difference between 6 and 5 is massive. Or my Desert Stew. If Desert Stew is -3 or -4 instead of -2, that's a huge difference on the card. Like just like gigantic upgrade. So if I open my pack and the rare is not that exciting, the uncommons aren't great, it's just nothing that really stands out to me, I'm not sad. In fact, I'm pretty happy to first pick a black or green desert. Festering Gulch, I've mentioned previously that I think this is the best dual land because, it's both black and green, of course, and Desert Stew plus the green deserts payoffs that you can pick up. Those are the colors that most care about deserts, but any green one, any green desert or any black desert, I'm happy to take. Like, even just like the half uncolor ones, green, blue, white, black. Because the green ones, that's where you have the largest density of desert stuff like Outcaster Greenblade, the 3-mana 1/2 uncommon that goes and gets a desert and then grows for the number of deserts you control. Cactarantula, something like Colossal Rattleworm, the rare, the 4-mana 6/5 that has flash if you have a desert. Just like with the Desert Stew and Cactarantula, like giving this thing flash is a big upgrade. Not just so you can ambush something, but so it isn't getting exposed to sorcery speed removal the turn you cast it. But then for the black deserts, like I mentioned with Desert Stew, I've heard a lot of people kind of be lowish on Desert Stew, and I've been, I think, higher than most people on the card throughout the format. And I think it just is because I take deserts a little bit higher than some people might, where I'm really, I'm not hoping for this to be -2, -2. I'm hoping this to be -4, -5. But then the other reason the black deserts are good is because all the crime stuff, right? So if you don't end up in a green deck, you're still going to want the black deserts because the black cards have the highest density of committing your crime things. So the thing I just really want to get across here, and the thing that I think is different from earlier in the format, is if you're somebody who is kind of expecting to see deserts, pick 6, pick 7, pick them up around there, I don't think you can do that. I think you should just be taking them. Consider them good picks. Consider them not only cards that let you play more cards, but make a lot of your other cards better. And that lets you play more cards part, I didn't even talk about that. But one of the things about formats developing and people drafting the good cards earlier is you have to splash a little bit more often. Your decks often become a little less streamlined, a little bit less synergistic, a little more power-based. And the more power you can get into your deck, the more options you've taken for fixing early on, the easier it becomes to, at the end of the draft, be like, hey, my deck is requisite power level. I can compete with somebody who maybe does have a streamlined good 2-color deck because I was able to take another removal spell, a good rare, because I did first pick that blue-green dual land. And that segues us into like the last big picture point I have of how I think you want to approach the format differently or think about the format differently, at very least how I've been drafting the format a little bit differently. You're just not going to get the sicko green-white deck very often, or really any color pair, unless you're in a very open seat where it's like, wow, these two colors are really open, I'm just getting all the goods. And you'll notice, I'm sure, as you've drafted more and more, it's more difficult to say at the end of pack 1, yes, I am supposed to be in these colors because these are the ones coming to me often. And especially if you are in a high level draft on an arena day 2 open or something like that, the colors are going to be drafted all at an appropriate level because people understand what the good cards are. That just keeps, it's a theme that keeps coming up. People know what the good cards are, so things get harder for you. So what that means is you should expect your deck to be a little bit less streamlined, needing to splash a little bit more to get more power into your deck to make up for a lack of synergy. So wherever I can pick up a free 5-color fixer somewhere where there's nothing awesome for me to take in the pack, I will do so that when I open a great rare, a Tumblewag pack 3, a Dust Animus, whatever it is, I am just able to play it. So Conduit Pylons, the desert that surveils and filters your mana. This is a card that I think you should be taking highly anyways. Like, just like I was talking about with the dual lands, the desert dual lands, I'm not sad to first pick this card. I think it's very flexible, goes in a lot of decks, makes a lot of decks better. Bandit's Hull is another one that I like a lot that I've talked about before, the 3-mana artifact that adds a mana of any color. When you commit a crime, you put a counter on it, and you can pay 2 to tap it to remove 2 counters from it to draw a card. Like, these two are cards I just like taking highly, but stuff like Oasis Gardener, the 3-mana 2/2 that ETBs gains 2, taps out a mana of any color. Red Rock Sentinel, the 3-mana 2/4 defender, sack a land, pay 2, draw a card, make a treasure token. Even the lowly Silver Deputy, the 2-mana 1/2. Like, this is a card you get last pick. And I do actually hope Silver Deputy doesn't have to make my deck. But if Silver Deputy makes my deck because it allows me to play that Dust Animus or that Tumblewag, that is totally fine. So things are just a little more scrappy. You should expect to have to or want to splash. If I just go down my 17 lands event history, I think over 50% of my decks have been splashing at least a card. I think it's just a bit of a mindset shift. You shouldn't really go into your draft thinking, okay, the goal of this draft is to figure out the 2 most open colors and be in those colors. It's a lot more cooking. It's a lot more figuring out what you should do based on each pack you see, adjusting each pack to pack, being like, okay, I can be a little more streamlined here, or I have to pick up some fixing, play these bombs that I picked up early and then this color wasn't open. You need to be flexible. You need to be dynamic. And if you're enjoying the show and you want to support it, go check out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. That's where you can go to support this show. Any of the content that I do really helps keep the show going. And of course, like I always say, there's a bunch of rewards over there that we want to give back to you if you choose to support us. So go check that out if you're interested in those rewards, which, by the way, are all directed at getting you better at limited magic somehow. Or if you want to just support the show, you like what we're doing here, you feel like you've gotten a little bit of value. Patreon.com/limitedlevelups. So with some big picture thoughts out of the way, I think the next place that's good to go is just a check-in on all the colors and how often I'm getting into these colors, how strong I think they are, my willingness to first pick a card of various colors. Let's start with green, because green is the best color in the format, the strongest overall. If you're just opening a sealed pool, you're hoping that your sealed pool is full of green cards. There was a period in the middle of the format, maybe like 3 weeks ago, where I had a lot of failed drafts because I was getting into green for the wrong reasons. And actually, through a lot of my coaching sessions, I've had a lot of people kind of say the same thing where like, I'm always in green, but I'm not really winning that much. And what I realized was happening was I was kind of getting baited a little bit by like 5th pick Throw from the Saddle, or like, 6th pick Giant Beaver. Solid cards, definitely cards I'm happy to have in my deck. But green's got the thing going on, like some colors and some formats do, where it's really deep. So you can just have a few cards slip through the cracks in the middle of the pack, and you're like, oh, okay, well, at the end of pack 1, I've got 4 pretty good green cards, like a solid uncommon, a few pretty good commons, and it looks like a good green base. Like, those actually might be the best cards that you saw for that pack. But then pack 2 and pack 3, especially pack 3, because what you see in pack 1 is what you see in pack 3 often, are just disasters, because what actually happened was somebody else was drafting green ahead of you. You got their scraps, and then pack 3, you just didn't get anything good. Because in my mind, pack 3 is like your payoff pack, where that's where you're going to see the most power. It's where people can't just take the best card of the pack. It's where you're hoping to get rewarded for reading what was open. And I realized this was happening over and over and over again, where I was just taking that Throw from the Saddle as my first green card, pick 4, pick 5, and then the rest of my drafts were really dry on the colors that I was in, my main colors. Maybe sometimes my other color was deep enough that it didn't matter. I played 7 green cards, 1 kind of weakish green card in there, and I still had a fine deck. But if I wasn't blinded by green's really good, I should draft green, and I was just more taking the best card in the pack a little more often or a little bit later into the draft, I think I would have had a better deck. So where I've kind of landed on this is I want to start with good uncommons or rares to really be happy being in green, or at least be happy fighting for green, because everybody at the table is going to be fighting for green early on, or at least most people at the table will be fighting for green early on. I think that's just something you should expect. So if you're going to participate in that fight, I think you need good reasons to do so. So I think if I'm going to first pick a good green rare and then get past a Spinewood Armadillo or an Outcast of Greenblade, that's about good enough, right? 2 really solid cards. I pick up that 4th or 5th pick, Throw it from the Saddle. Maybe I get some medium green cards at the end of pack 1, and that's just like, now I've got 7 cards at the end of pack 1 that are green, that are great. But the other thing about this is a lot of the green rares are actually just splashable, right? Ornery Tumblewag, the 3-mana 2/2 that puts a counter on something you in your combat. Railway Brawler, the 3 green 5/5 reach trample that puts X counters on creatures that enter the battlefield under your control, where X is their power, but it has a plot cost of 3 and a green. Goldvein Hydra, the X green Hydra. Like, don't first pick a green card, get to middle of pack 1 and go, uh-oh, green's not open, but I've got a really good green bomb and I want to play it, and put the blinders on. Like I was saying a few minutes ago, be dynamic. Think, well, maybe I splash this instead. I guess sort of a unified theory or unified way of putting this all is when you're drafting, and this applies to all colors, but I think especially when you start green, I've found the most success just taking the best card in the pack for a little bit longer into pack 1 than I would normally. Like in a lot of draft formats, I like to do the thing where, I first pick a great green rare or whatever color rare, and then next pack, there's a good black card and a slightly worse green card. Okay, I'll take the slightly worse green card. Pack 3, same thing happens. I'll take the slightly worse green card. Pick after pick, I'm doing that, and I'm not taking the best card in the pack. The idea there being that if you can get deep into one color and you get to play your great rare, that's great for you. But because the fixing is so prevalent in the set, and at the very least where I'm prioritizing fixing, color matters just a little bit less. You want to make sure that your base 2 colors are solid. They're pretty open, so that cards 1 to 17, 18, 19 are just good cards in 2 colors. But don't hold on to your bomb for too long, because a lot of the good rares can just be splash. So yeah, takeaway from green here, I think, is just don't get blinded by the commons that might slip through the cracks, and look for opportunities where you can move into more open colors as a good base and just splash the good rares or good high quality uncommons like an Outcast or Greenblade that you saw early. All right, black now. So black, never was really that far behind of green as far as the best color in the format. And I've come to the point where I draft black more than any color. I just, going down my 70 lands event history, 80% plus of my decks are black, because I think it's about as good as green is, but the cards that I like in black don't get drafted as highly as the good green cards. The ones that do get drafted highly, I'm happy to take, like Desert Stew, Consuming Ashes, like the 2 good removal spells. But cards like Desperate Bloodseeker, the 2/2 lifelink that mills somebody for 2, Vault Plunder, the 3-mana 3/1 that ETBs, draws a card, lose a life, Ambush Gigapede, 6-mana 6/2 flash, comes in, gives something -2/-2. Like, this package of 5 commons, I think sits in like the perfect range of, I'm happy to take the best of them early, the Plunderer and the 2 removal spells. And then Bloodseeker and Gigapede, I can pick up multiple copies of those, and I'm totally happy with multiple copies of those to fill up my deck, and they're cards that you get pick 6+. Gigapede in particular, you wheel a good amount of the time. And then past that, some of the more niche cards like Ravenfell Omens, Nezumi Linkbreaker, that's the 1-mana 1/1 that dies into a mercenary, Rooftop Assassin, it's the 4-mana 2/2 flash lifelink flying that when ATBs kill something that was dealt damage this turn. I'm not going to play these in all of my black decks, but the black decks I do play them in, the crime decks for the Raven and like black-white, or kind of like similar decks for Linkbreaker and Assassin, very good cards in those decks. Yeah, I just think black is really flexible. It's the color I most want to start in. It's just about as deep as green, but now that the format has panned out, we've kind of seen where people on average take cards. People take the black cards a good notch later than the green cards. So in my books, I think it is the quote-unquote best color as far as your expected value for drafting the color early on. Oh, and I almost just forgot here. How could I forget? Mourner's Surprise, the 2-mana buy something back from the graveyard, make a mercenary token, falls in the same camp as Bloodseeker and Gigapede, a card that I think is quite good, and I'm happy to play multiple copies, especially if I have a bunch of great things to get back, and people don't value the card as highly as I do, so I just get them a bit later, and that's just a little bit of an edge I can gain on the format. All right, then we get to white, and we've got, the usual suspects for white. There's like a package of 4 good white commons that everybody knows is pretty good. That's Mystical Tether, the white removal spell, Trained Airings, the 3/1 that can gain first strike when you saddle it, Holy Cow, the flash flyer that scries 2 and gains a life when it enters, and Take Up the Shield, the combat trick that gives +1/+1 counter to a creature, and lifelink and indestructible. So these cards are just good, but there are 2 cards that I think are kind of underrated. We're going to get to talking about these when we talk about the white decks, black-white and red-white. Outlaw Medic, which is more a black-white card than a red-white card, but I really have come up on this card in a lot of ways. This is the 1 and a white 1/3 lifelink that when it dies, draw a card. And Sterling Supplier is the 5-mana 3/4 flyer that when it comes in, you put a +1/+1 counter on another target creature. Just like with some of those black cards I think are a little bit underrated, these are 2 cards that you get later than I think you should, generally. You get them on the wheel sometimes. I've gotten Sterling Supplier's last pick sometimes, and they're cards that I am very happy to fill up my deck with. So while white is not quite as deep as black, I see it sort of similarly, where there's a handful of cards that are really good at common, and I'm happy to take these cards fairly early, but then there are some niche cards or some cards that people are underrating where I think you can gain an edge. And even among those 4 great cards that I mentioned, I think Holy Cow is a card that's actually a little bit underrated. I get that card later than I might expect to. I get it, sometimes pick 6, pick 7. I would be happy to take it a little bit early. And then Take Up the Shield, nobody's fault. It's not like they're misevaluating, but you just can't play all the Take Up the Shields in the world. So once you have your first 2, other white drafters at the table aren't going to be like, well, I'm going to take 3 and haha, I got all the Take Up the Shields. You're generally going to get Take Up the Shield, which is a quality card in most decks at some point because it is a card that has diminishing returns. All right, so far we're talking about the colors. There hasn't been any giant shifts in my opinions. I'm a little bit less likely to draft green, a little bit more likely to draft black, but I have no problems drafting blue anymore. We're week 1 or 2 of the format. I didn't quite feel that to be true. I think blue is maybe the most underrated color at this point. That doesn't mean that it is the best color, but as far as how good I think the color is relative to where people are taking the cards, I think it might be the most underrated. It has a good handful of commons I like. I like Phantom Interference. I like Take the Fall, the 1-mana cantrip. I like Loan Shark, the 3/4 that if you've cast your second spell this turn, draw a card and it's got plot. I like Jailbreak Scheme, which is the spree card. You can put a creature or artifact on top of somebody's library, or you can give it something +1/+1 and unblockable this turn. I even have come up on Razzle Dazzler a little bit, the 1/2 that whenever you cast your second spell a turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. It can't be blocked. So I don't like it just in any deck. But if you have multiple Take the Falls, that's something that I'm looking to pair with it, or just like a lot of cheap spells, Take the Fall being one of the better ones because it's a 1-mana spell that draws you into something else. Or the place that I actually really like Razzle Dazzler, not in blue-red, but in blue-black, if you've got Intimidation Campaign. The 1 blue-black enchantment comes in, draws a card, gains a life, and you can pick it up whenever you cast a crime. Because if you have Intimidation Campaign, you're consistently casting 2 spells a turn because you get to just pick up the campaign and replay it. If you get a single counter on the Razzle Dazzler, it's a fine blocker in the early game for a control deck. And then if you do keep going, it's something they have to respect. It's something they have to remove at some point, or you just kill them at some point where you get 1 big hit in and then your Intimidation Campaign drains them out. A flyer gets in for a hit. You kind of nickel and dime them. So this is a card that was very much, I had as never want to play this. It's just too weak. 2-mana 1/2. They have to do some work to grow. But if you are a deck that is drawing a bunch of cards, specifically has Intimidation Campaign, has Take the Fall. I think it's a totally fine 2-drop. So what blue wants to do, what I've had a lot of success doing in blue, is essentially just outcard your opponents. There's a lot of cards that just put you up a lot of cards in blue. One of the ones I like a ton and I think is kind of underrated is Plan the Heist. So it says 2 blue for a sorcery, Surveil 3 if you have no cards in hand, and you draw 3 cards, and it's got Plot for 3 and a blue. Love this card. I think it's great. I think just having some removal spells, having some cheap blockers, refilling with this, very much like a boomer blue deck in a lot of ways. Metamorphic Blast, that's another one I like a lot. This is the spree card that you can either pay 3 to draw 2 cards or pay an additional 1 to make something an 0/1 rabbit. Even Seize the Secrets, that common, the 3 mana sorcery divination that costs 1 less if you've committed a crime this turn. I'm looking for, maybe 4 or 5 card advantage spells in my deck, and if I don't get the uncommons I just talked about, I'm totally happy playing Seize the Secrets, especially if you do have some cheap ways to commit crimes. If you move into other colors, you get Make Your Own Luck in blue-green. That's another version. It's another draw 3. Loan Shark helps this plan too. So it is kind of the, when you're thinking about control decks, you often hear people saying, you don't need a winning condition. You just need to draw a bunch of cards. And I do think my blue decks play out like that fairly often. Of course, it helps if you have a good rare. If you have a Sphinx, the 5/3 flash, has hexproof as long as you haven't cast a spell this turn. Yeah, that's great. That's easy mode, right? You just get to kill them. But another thing I really like about blue is I think, along with some of those uncommons I just mentioned, it's got a few other pretty underrated uncommons. So Outlaw Stitcher, this is the 4 mana 1/4 that ETBs makes a 2/2 zombie, and that zombie gets 2 +1/+1 counters for each spell you've cast this turn other than the first, and it's got Plot for 5 mana. This is a card that a lot of people pegged as like busted, one of the best uncommons at the beginning of the format, and I think blue ended up not being one of the better colors. People cooled on it a little bit. I still really like the card. I think people have actually overcorrected a little bit to where their expectations were really, really high. Mine included. I thought this card was just gonna be awesome. But I still think it's really good. Like, I'm still a fan of it, and I get it. Sometimes 4th, 5th pick. Slick Shot Lockpicker. This is one I've talked about before that is also awesome. This is the 3 mana 2/3 with Plot for 3 mana. When it enters the battlefield, target instant or sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback. The flashback cost is equal to the mana cost. I take this card very highly because it's not just good in the blue decks, it's good as a splash in black-green decks where you have recursion spells, or kind of a niche thing that I've actually been doing lately is playing this in like a black-green deck with Rise of the Varmints. That's the spell, the Plot spell that makes 2/1 creatures equal to the number of creatures in your graveyard. So being able to mill a bunch, and if you mill your Rise, then you get to flash this back with Lockpicker. You have recursion spells to like buy back the Lockpicker, so you can do some really nasty stuff. Just really have these awesome inevitability engines, and Lockpicker really enables that. Not just with Rise of the Varmints, but buying back your Lockpicker with a Badlands Revival, the 3 black-green uncommon that reanimates something and buys something back. So a powerful card, a flexible card, a card that I splash quite a bit. And then one more underrated uncommon here is Canyon Crab. This is the 1 in a blue 0/5 that you can pay 1 in a blue to give it +2, -2 until end of turn, and then if you haven't cast a spell from your hand this turn, you draw a card and then discard a card. Not a lot of great 2s in this set, and this is one of the better ones. Really, really slows down the opponent. Your opponent goes Trained Airynx on turn 2, which is one of the worst things that your blue deck can see. You play Canyon Crab, you stop that. You probably stop their 3-drop as well. Not a card you have to take highly, but one that I am happy to have in my deck, and just like a few of the other cards I've been talking about, one that I think you get later than you ought to. There's also just a few cards on the bonus sheet, like Repulse, the 3 mana bounce something draw card. That card's great. So yeah, my stamp I'm gonna put on blue here is I have no issue drafting the color. If you're somebody who isn't as comfortable drafting these like blue, just outcard them, just draw a bunch of cards, survive, and then make it so that they concede due to inducing despair into their soul, because they're never going to beat the 7 cards you've drawn over the course of the game. If those are not decks that you're comfortable with, depends on what your goals are, but I would say that if you want to practice drafting those kind of decks, I think this is a pretty good one to do so. And it's even better because, like I mentioned, I do think blue is a little bit underdrafted, so if you start with the Sphinx or some good blue rare, you are likely to see a lot of the cards that you'll want, the ones that I just mentioned. And then we move on to red. So I have not had a sweeping change of heart like I have with blue with red, but I'm happy to call it a solid support color. I think there's enough commons here, enough uncommons you can pick up if it's open, that it is good at filling out a deck where your other color is already pretty open. The trouble you run into with red is you just don't want to make it a base color. You don't want to have 13 red cards in your deck because there's generally not enough good ones to go around. So the ones I'm looking to play are the removal spells. I think all of them are solid to some degree. Explosive Derailment, the deal 4, or you can pay an additional 2 to destroy an artifact. This one's good. Yeah, just like a good removal spell. Trick Shot, I even don't mind. This is the 5 mana instant. Deal 6 to something and 2 to up to 1 target token. And Thunder Salvo, the 2 mana, deal 2 plus X for X the number of other spells you've cast this turn. All three of these play the support role fine, especially if you don't have a lot of other removal. This is actually kind of a nice thing that red provides. These cards that go pretty late, even explosive derailment, sometimes you get 8th, 9th pick, that you are able to check off that box of you need removal in this format, and these can kind of get the job done. And then 2 creatures here, Prickly Pear, 3 mana 2/2 comes with the Mercenary, and Discerning Peddler, 2 mana 2/2 that enters, and you can discard a card to then draw a card. Both these cards pretty solid. Prickly Pear, the better of the bunch for sure. One card I want to call out that maybe isn't quite a trap, but I think it's played in the wrong spots is Irascible Wolverine. This is the 3 mana 3/2 that ETBs, exiles a card from the top of your library. You can play that this turn, and it's got plot for 3 mana. So this card, you don't really want it in your red-white decks or your green-red decks. I think it's fine in a grindy black-red deck or like a more controlling blue-red deck. Issue with this card is you just don't really want to ever play it on turn 3. You want to plot it on turn 3, and your aggressive decks can't afford to not get on board on turn 3. It wouldn't be an absolute disaster if it made it into a red-white deck, but I do try not to play it if I am one of the more aggressive decks. So good, filler creature if you are a slower deck, not so much if you're beating down. And then one more word of caution for red is that red's got a lot of pretty good rares, like Laughing Jasper Flint, Roxanne, Stingerback Terror, which is a 2 red 7/7 flying trample that gets -1/-1 for each card in your hand, but it's got plot for 2 in a red. And the word of caution I have for these rares is, I think something that's been kind of said multiple places, my podcast included, is you need a reason to be in red to really want to move in. And I don't really consider the cards I just listed, maybe like Bruce Tarl's another example, as reasons to move into red. These are all splashable cards. Stingerback Terror with the plot cost being splashable. I take these cards, I don't think, okay, I should draft red cards. I think I'm going to splash these somehow. Maybe, you do end up with that situation I talked about where you're using red as a support color to support another color that's quite open, but I'm more hoping you have 3 or 4 sources of red in my deck to play these cards rather than 8 mountains or something to support these cards. Alright, now to talk about some archetypes. Those 2 that I mentioned earlier, I think decks are good places to be right now. Black-white and red-white. Let's talk about black-white first. And I see there's kind of like 2 different ways to draft black-white. One is the more classic, just grindy black-white deck. A little bit of sacrifice stuff going on. You're just trying to attrition your opponent out of the game. But then there's a second black-white deck that uses some really scrappy, not great commons, black-white flyers. We'll get to that in a second. I do want to outline the key parts of like a black-white grindy deck first, because this is the more common version of the deck. I think it's the more powerful version of the deck too. So ultimately what you're trying to do with a black-white grindy controlling deck is gum up the ground, make it so your opponent can't attack that well with small creatures, use your removal spells on threats that actually matter, and then grind out card advantage with a few tools that we're gonna touch on here. So between this deck and the flyer deck, the black-white flyer deck, both decks, the thread that they have in common is they really want a lot of removal, and they also have access to a lot of removal too. Both black and white are pretty deep as far as the removal goes. There's a million Oblivion Ring effects in this set. Black's got the good common removal, some good uncommon removal, and one of the key pieces to this deck, Ruthless Lawbringer, which is the 1 black-white 3/2 that you can sacrifice another creature. When you do, destroy target non-land permanent. This card is excellent. You really want to pair it with ways to recur it. So something like Lively Dirge or just a Mourner Surprise. Sometimes you end up splashing green for some recursion in this deck, so maybe you Badlands Revival it back. But if you have a Lawbringer, that just turns all of your recursion spells into removal spells, so you get that density of removal you really want. I would say I'm aiming for like 6, 7, 8 removal spells at a minimum, and I could play more than that if I had them. 2 cards that I like to just kind of gum up the ground: Nezumi Linkbreaker, which is the 1 mana 1/1 that makes a mercenary when it dies, and Outlaw Medic, which is the 1 and a white 1/3 lifelink that when it dies, draw a card. So I mentioned a bit earlier, I've really come up on this card, and the reason is that in this deck, it's a really good 2-drop. Like, your opponents are hesitant to attack into it. It teams up in double blocks to gain a little additional life here and there. And both of these cards, Nezumi Linkbreaker and Outlaw Medic, play well with Rooftop Assassin, which is an additional removal spell in this deck. So this is the 4 mana 2/2 Flying Flash lifelink that when it comes in, it kills something that was dealt damage. Trumping with your Medic, drawing a card, then killing the thing with Assassin, or with your Linkbreaker, doing that twice. That's really nice. So Assassin is just another way you can kind of up the removal count in your deck without needing a bunch of premium removal spells, because that's kind of the issue. You know, I mentioned for both these decks, this black-white control deck and a black-white flyer deck, you want a lot of removal, and that's just not something you can always get. But Assassin is a card you get very late, and you can use that to good effect in this deck. Also, just the 2/2 lifelinking flying, like that can close at the game, give you a bit of a life buffer. I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I want to call attention to this Lively Dirge package, which is the 2-mana black spree card that you can pay an additional mana to put something from your deck into your graveyard, and then an additional 2 to reanimate 2 creatures with mana value total 4 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So the package you really want with this is Nezumi Linkbreaker, the 1-mana 1/1 that I just talked about, Ruthless Lawbringer, the black-white uncommon, or Unscrupulous Contractor, which is the 3-mana 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, you can sack a creature. When you do, target player draws 2 cards, loses 2 life. So either of these 3-mana cards with Linkbreaker just ends up being pretty good. Dirge also goes up in value if you just have a 4-mana bomb, like a Bruce Tarl that you're splashing, or maybe some good 2-mana cards, like you have a Caustic Bronco in your deck and some other 2-drop that you want to go get. And then for the card advantage side of things, so Bandit's Hull, which is a 3-mana manalith that draws you cards when you commit crimes. Like, this is definitely a card that I played a lot in my black-white control decks. I'll play multiple copies. You want to make sure you've got enough ways to trigger this between your lands and your spells, of course, but in black-white, really not that hard. More surprise, the 2-mana, buy something back, make a mercenary. Like, not exactly like a card advantage card, but helps you get your better cards back, help you grind. And Corrupted Conviction. So Corrupted Conviction is the single black mana instant. As an additional cost to cast it, you sack a creature and you draw 2 cards. So this is a card that I think is kind of the worst of the ways to grind out card advantage. You get it basically for free. I say it's the worst because you have to really engineer a situation or engineer some cards, combinations of cards that make it good. Like, you can't just sacrifice anything, of course. You have to sacrifice something that gives you value, and even sacrificing like a Nezumi Linkbreaker. You traded 2 cards for 2 cards and you're up a 1/1, so you're only getting like a very marginal amount of value. Sacrificing an Outlaw Medic is probably one of the better things to do because you get to trade in your 2 cards for 3 cards, and in the process, medics may be attacked, blocked a few times. Maybe you get to block and sack versus a big creature. So turning your 2 cards into 3 cards and gaining like 5-6 life virtually, that's a pretty good deal. So I do like that. I think Corrupted Conviction paired with Outlaw Medic is one of the better things. Or Corrupted Conviction paired with something like Lassoed by the Law, something that just makes a mercenary when it comes in. Conviction is nice because it's reliable to get. You're just going to get these. You can play 2-3 copies if you have a deck that's really good for it, but it needs more setup than the other card advantage tools. This is a deck in that I splash in quite frequently, either with the Bandit's Hull or with dual lands. I mentioned Badlands Revival, the black-green uncommon that you can use to recur your good creatures. Maybe you're splashing a good rare, like Laughing Jasper Flint. Maybe you're splashing with Treasure Dredger, which is the 2-mana 2/2, 1 tap, pay a life, create a treasure token. And this is going to lead us into 2 kind of niche cards that this deck can use, but kind of needs the right cards to be able to use them. So Baron Bertram Greywater. This is the 2 black-white 3/4 uncommon that whenever 1 or more tokens enters the battlefield under your control, you make a 1/1 lifelinking vampire token, and it's got the ability 1 in a black to sacrifice another artifact or creature, draw a card. I don't like this card very much unless you've got just a great deck for it. Like, you need to have a lot of things that are good to sacrifice, a lot of Nezumi Linkbreakers, a lot of Outlaw Medics. If this is just sitting there and you're like, well, maybe it blanks a removal spell once in a while, that's just not good enough. Paying 4 mana for a 3/4 that does that isn't quite good enough. But I have found this to be pretty good if you can really create an engine with it, which brings me back to Treasure Dredger, because Bertram allows you to stack artifacts as well. So if you can go pay a life, make a treasure, sacrifice that treasure each turn, that's a pretty nice combo. And sometimes those cards, like, you just want Dredger in your deck because maybe you're short on a 2-drop, maybe you are splashing, then you can go, okay, Baron makes sense there. Oh, also, forgot to mention when I was talking about the Treasure Dredger Baron little interaction here. Baron says whenever 1 or more tokens enters the battlefield under your control. So that counts your treasure tokens too. So in the process of treasure dredgering each turn, you're going to make a 1/1 vampire. So it actually is a very good engine. Treasure Dredger and Baron, that's something I would look out for. And another kind of niche card that I've been putting in more and more decks is Nurturing Pixie. This is the white mana 1/1. It's a flyer, it's uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you can pick up a non-land permanent you control, return it to your hand, and if a permanent was returned this way, put a +1/+1 counter on Nurturing Pixie. So a lot of cards that we've already talked about for this deck are pretty good to pick up and reuse their ETB effects, like Ruthless Lawbringer. That's a really good one, just to reuse that. Rooftop Assassin, even, picking that one up. I mentioned that a lot of times your white removal is the Oblivion Rings effects, you know, the enchantments that come in and exile something, and what you can do is, like, exile a 2-drop on turn 3 or a 3-drop on turn 3, and then pick up the pixie later, exile something more important. Or ideally what you do is you exile a big token like Dance of the Tumbleweeds token or something like that. Pixie can then pick up the enchantment, you exile something else. So yeah, not a card you're going to play in all your black-white decks by any means, but it is a card that I know is on very few people's radar at this point. And another thing, Lively Dirge, right? If you have Lively Dirge, then Pixie goes up in value a little bit, because what you can do is like Lively Dirge for the Pixie and for the Ruthless Lawbringer. Ruthless Lawbringer sacrifices something else, and then the Pixie picks up the Lawbringer, and you can sacrifice the Pixie or whatever to the Lawbringer again. You get 2 triggers. So I was talking about Nezumi Linkbreaker as the card you want to pair with Ruthless Lawbringer and Unscrupulous Contractor. Nurturing Pixie fits that role as well. So that's the black-white grindy version of the deck, and I do think that is the better version, but something that I have encountered drafting this deck a lot is you start down the path of like, okay, I first pick a Ruthless Lawbringer, pick up a few removal spells. Like I mentioned, you really want to prioritize removal spells highly when you're in one of these kind of decks, or think you're going to be moving towards one of these kind of decks. And then the card advantage tools just don't come to you, right? You don't get the Bandit's Halls. You see the Corrupted Convictions, but you don't see the things that are good to sacrifice. When you're playing a slower deck like this, you can't really just rely on, I'm going to draw the cards in the right order. You need ways to churn through your deck and ways to guarantee that you're going to win the late game. So if you don't end up with those, you need to pivot to something that ends the game a little bit sooner. And something that I have found pretty good is this black-white flyer deck that uses a lot of commons that nobody really wants. So there are good flyers in black and white. There's Holy Cow, you know, the 3-mana 2/2 flash. There's the Rooftop Assassin we just talked about. There's Sterling Supplier, the 5-mana 3/4 that comes in, puts a +1/+1 counter on something. Plays pretty nicely with the Rooftop Assassin, giving lifelink. I talked about Nurturing Pixie, so you can do that too. There's some good uncommon ones like Shepherd of the Clouds, which is the 5-mana 4/3 Flying Vigilance that comes in and rebuys a permanent mana value 3 or less, or puts it on the battlefield if you have a mount. Hollow Marauder, the 7-mana 4/2 in black that makes your opponent discard something, and you draw a card if they didn't discard a card 4 mana value or more. So there's some good things in there, but you don't always pick up the really good things, right? Mostly you're going to get the kind of medium ones. Holy Cow is one that, you know, I think you could pick up with some regularity. Like I mentioned, I think it's slightly underdrafted, but Black Snag Buzzard is a card that actually isn't that bad. So this is the 3-mana 2/1 flyer with plot for 1 and a black. It enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it if a creature died this turn. So when you've got a lot of removal, this is going to pretty consistently be a 3-power creature. Also Wanted Griffin, which is the 4-mana 3/2 flyer that when it dies make a mercenary token. Like, it's kind of okay in this deck. You're going to use Outlaw Medic if you can pick those up. The 1/3 lifelinker that when it dies draw the card. That's kind of like your ground defenses as your flyers fly over. So it's playing a sort of similar game, but this backup plan kind of works because flyers play well with a density of removal. Because, you know, whenever you're playing a flyer deck, the issue is your opponent's ground creatures. They're big green ground creatures. Those green creatures are going to kill you before the flyers can kill your opponent, because flyers tend to be smaller than big ground creatures. So you're kind of playing a similar game plan where you're just managing the board, but then just racing them in the air. So yeah, hope this is a helpful tool in your tool belt, because it's something that's definitely helped me in some drafts that have kind of gone a bit awry. Oh, also, I should mention Raven of Fell Omens, the 2-mana 1/2 flyer in black that whenever you commit a crime, you drain your opponent for 1. Also just a fine card to put in this deck too. And then we move on to red-white. So I think the reason why red-white is good now is similar to the reasons I was describing with blue-red. How, you know, there's not been like some gigantic shift where it's like, oh wow, we figured out the secret to these decks, now we can draft these. I think it's just that the cards that are important to these decks, people aren't drafting as highly, so you get them at a range in the draft where you're happy to take them. So Prickly Pear, I think, is a really good example of this. You do get this card 6, 7 sometimes, and this is one of the better commons for the deck. 2 good uncommon red creatures here, Cunning Coyote and Resilient Roadrunner, you know, the pair of good 2 uncommon red 2-drops. Those cards you get pretty late too, where I think before people were first, second picking them. And that was really what this deck was missing before, that consistency of good early creatures. You just couldn't really get that, and now you can a little bit easier. Trade Erranks, great. You know, obviously this card's still really good in this deck. Eartha Joe, this is another one that I think people took really, really early before, but you get this 4th, 5th, 6th pick sometimes. Other 2-drops I don't mind playing, Discerning Peddler, it's the red 2/2 that rummages when it comes in. Sterling Keykeeper, that's the white 2/2 that taps stuff. Take Up the Shield, of course, very important to any aggressive strategy. Owenport Vigilante is an interesting one, so this is the 1 and a white 2/2 uncommon. It's a mercenary, and it says it has double strike as long as you've committed a crime this turn. So if you do have a good amount of removal, Owenport Vigilante becomes a good 2-drop. It's especially kind of of nice with Thunder Lasso, which is the 3 mana white equipment that gives something +1/+1. And whenever the creature attacks, the equipped creature attacks, you tap target creature defending player controls. So that's pretty nice with the Vigilante, just committing a crime every single turn, attacking as a 3/3 double striker. One of the problems that does still exist for this deck is its cheap creatures aren't that good at attacking by themselves. So what that means is to support them, you either need a good handful of removal spells, which is something you're already looking for in this format. You really want that 4, 5, 6 number of removal spells, or I should say, both of these are good if you can have them. You want your expensive cards to be evasive creatures, to be flying creatures, so that when your Coyotes and your Roadrunners and your Trained Aryxes, they get in for the first 12, 10 points, you can then finish the game with Sterling Suppliers, Holy Cows, even Wanted Griffin, the 4 mana 3/2 that dies into a mercenary. That's kind of the blueprint here. So it's not too hard, really. It's just you want removal. You want as many of the good 2-drops as you can, which do come a little bit later to you. I think your most important commons are like Trained Aryx and Prickly Pear. If you can go Trained Aryx into Prickly Pear every game, that's going to be great. And then your finishers, quote unquote, are just evasive creatures. Things that your opponents can't block that easily, because that is a problem with the aggro decks in this format. They get brick-walled pretty quickly. You need a way to go over that. And as some final thoughts to close out this episode, I just wanted to give some navigation tips, some pitfalls you might want to avoid, some things I think are good to keep in mind as you're drafting. As I've gone through people's draft logs and coaching sessions in the past few weeks, I think the two main issues that people encounter in navigation are not having enough power in their deck or not having enough fixing in their deck. And what this stems from is not clocking early-ish in the draft, around pack 1, beginning of pack 2, if you're able to draft a streamlined 2-color deck, or if you need to reach into other colors to splash, you're trying to be a bit of a slower, grindier deck. Because I think what's happened, what I've observed happens a lot of the time, is that green-white situation we were talking about at the beginning of the episode, where you start down a green-white path, and you're just taking green and white cards, maybe you're not paying attention to exactly how open the colors are, but there's a playable card in each pack, so you're like, okay, let's just keep on doing this. But by the time you get to like the middle of pack 2, you look at your pile, and you started with that Miriam and that Congregation Gryff, and you're like, I picked up like one other premium card since that point. And then from that point, when you're like, I'm actually not in a place I'm supposed to be, you have two choices. Either you just pray that you're going to see good green and white cards in pack 3, or you start to pick up good cards of other colors. But the problem there is, if you thought you were a streamlined 2-color deck early on, maybe you didn't prioritize any 5-color fixing, conduit pylons, any dual lands. And so to remedy this issue of either ending up in an underpowered 2-color deck or in a multicolor deck that just does not have a good mana base, like you're just jamming a bunch of basics, you didn't pick up the fixing you needed, I would really pay attention to what happened at the end of your pack 1, or maybe even a little bit before the end of pack 1, like once you get to your wheel. Something that I think is just good draft advice in general is at the end of pack 1, ask yourself, rank 1 to 5 what the most and least open colors were. And if both your colors were some of the least open colors, well, then you probably aren't going to have a great time in the packs going forward. If they were, okay, sure. And if you've picked up good cards of your colors, like you've got 5, 6 premium cards or close to premium cards, great. I would say keep on drafting that good 2-color deck. But often I get the sense around pick 7, 8, 9, if I'm starting there, that I haven't picked that kind of stuff up. So in pack 2, I'll prioritize fixing, I'll prioritize off-color bombs, because I'm just not going to have the density of those good cards in 2 colors to be able to play a good 2-color deck. And this leads me to my second point, which is something I said earlier, but do make sure when you can, just pick up fixing. The Gardeners, the Bandits Halls, the lands, like I'm not saying take these over good cards. I'm just saying when it's a fairly free pick, like say you are drafting a green-white deck, don't take like a Free Strider Commando, the 3 mana 3/3 that you can plot it, and if you plot it, when you cast it becomes a 5/5. Take that Gardener instead, because a lot of my pivots in this format have been starting green-white or red-green, and then moving into a multicolor green deck, something like that, or starting a black-red deck, and then realizing, okay, I can't really be a streamlined outlaw black-red deck, I'll move into more of a Grixis crime deck. That works pretty well. I guess all in all, this is just to say, be a vigilant drafter. It's something that's a skill. It's not something I can just say, hey, do this, and you're going to do it. Not everybody has that skill, that tool in their tool belt just yet, but something to keep in mind. I really do think that check-in of what was the most open colors and what were the least open colors at the end of pack 1 can help put you on the right path. All right, and that's going to do it. Thank you so much. Good luck this weekend if you are playing the Arena Open, and good luck for the rest of your drafts for this format. We've got like, what, 3 weeks in this format still before Modern Horizons 3 is the main draft set on Arena, so hope you enjoyed this format. I had a lot of fun with it. I think this will probably be my last Thunder Junction episode, but hope you enjoy it. Let me know if you like this approach to the part 2 of the State of the Format address, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.